WN the next month in writing specific letters from me publicly to members of the Orioles organization. I am sort of utilizing all of the brain power that I have, which is what I do here at WNST, is try to find people smarter than me and talk to them about things that are sort of out of my pay grade so that I can write about them with some sort of expertise, if not at least competence. Marty Conway is one of the more competent dudes I know. He is the professor of sports business at Georgetown University. You can follow him, his journey, everything he does out on Twitter as well as on LinkedIn when he is generous enough to blog for us. He ran portions of the Baltimore Orioles for the better part of a decade in the 1980s under Edward Bennett Williams and Larry Lucchino, then went on to the Texas Rangers, AOL, and a bunch of other places. Now settled here in the DMV, and much like everyone else. Marty, you got a Stanley Cup champions hat yet? Have you gotten any swag for you and the family yet?
How could you miss it? It's setting records in terms of where it's selling and how much it's selling and all of that. So the benefits of a first-time Stanley Cup win and the benefits of Washington, D.C. and the surrounding markets. So, yeah, how could you not see it, get it? It's all over the place.
Well, yeah, and, I would say for whatever virus, right, that the fans of Richmond, D.C., Baltimore, Harrisburg, wherever it is, whatever that virus is that you catch when your team wins, that you want to go out and buy red and championship everything, the Orioles, it's been a long time since they've had sort of that mojo. You were a big part of building that with D.C. and the importance of D.C. as being not necessarily a secondary market for the Orioles, but part of what they would consider their primary market. Now the Orioles don't have that anymore, and I am writing this Dear Orioles series where they are stumbling, flailing like the fish at the end of the Faith No More video, and yet there's 4 months of baseball left. All of this monumental stuff from dealing Machado, what happens to Adam Jones, what becomes of Buck Showalter and his legacy, what becomes of Peter, quite frankly, and what becomes of John and Lou and how they run this thing. I think it's very, very clear Brady Anderson's not going anywhere. From my eyes, from anybody else, he will be the one that will still be there on opening day next year doing something, probably to the detriment of whoever decides to take the job. But we have a really dysfunctional mess here, and I'm trying to begin my series, Marty, by saying, what does the organization owe the fan base? What is our expectation? And I think it's very, very different for the Ravens than it is for the Orioles. And, hey, the Capitals are about to find out that their level of expectations change, right?
Yeah, I think it certainly starts at the top. And if you look at what's consistent about franchises that win consistently, competitive consistently, et cetera, in the ownership suite, it's the concept of hating to lose as much or more than you want to win. And that has a lot to do with it, because when, invariably things will turn down at every organization. It happened with the Caps, it happens with the Ravens, certainly happened with the Orioles. And to have that spine, if you will, that it is always the true sportsman at heart that says, I hate to lose as much or more than I want to win, because I will put a stop to the slide. I will put a stop to the 5-11 season in the NFL. I will put a stop to, heading out of the playoffs. And keeping leadership and management on a tight leash in that regard, that, you're going to have to show me the turnaround plan, and then you're going to have to turn it around. And if you don't, then, I will find somebody else to do it. That's what's missing. I don't see that changing. There's no indication that no matter whether the club here locally changes hands from father to sons or wife, that there's really that sort of burning. I think Buck Showalter has that, but there's only a certain amount that a manager can do when he doesn't control either the parts of the roster or the minor league development aspect.
Well, I mean, at some point, and when I wrote the Peter Principles, and I think, part of doing anything on a historical basis is to go back and say what used to be and what is, Peter hated losing. Peter hated everything about George Steinbrenner. Peter hated everything about the unfairness of how much money these other guys had and he didn't have. And at some point during the strike and after the strike and before the second work stoppage in 02-03 when he fell in with Andy MacPhail, someone pulled him up and said, dude, losing $75 million a year and finishing in last place is not a good idea. You may want to try winning 50 and then worrying about where you finish, because you'd be in better shape if you could make 50 and finish in last place than you could be if you finished in first place and lost 100, which he was on the road to doing at various points. That if he ever won with Jeff Conine and David Segui and Sidney Ponson, he was losing money anyway before the Washington thing happened, and he had a lifeline that came in and saved him with this Masson deal that has allowed him to operate the club in a way where it doesn't matter if they win or lose. Quite frankly, the NBA has that set up now, and baseball had that. Back in your day, dude, winning was like the only way you made money. You've said many times in the NHL, the only way to win, or the way to make money, is to win, extend your season, play more games, get more gates, sell more swag, do all that stuff that Ted has done now in D.C. by winning. But Peter's made a lot of money by losing, like literally. A lot of these guys have, and that's sort of the modern dilemma in a lot of cases, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But it can only go so far because at some point the nature of your losing costs you local revenues, which doesn't matter whether you're in the NFL or the NBA, whatever. And I've said this many times, your local revenue stream is what usually makes the difference between profit and loss, because the dollars that you're going to get from national or maybe even international sources will bring you up to a certain level, but your level of profitability is driven by those local sponsorships, excessive ticket sales above a certain amount, and other aspects like that. So this is where they have gotten into, a bit of trouble, and that is certainly since baseball's been in Washington for 10 years, some of that marginal revenue has disappeared, and part of it is just, competing against them. Part of it is strategy along the way.
Part of it also is the Nationals are good. If the Nationals sucked as bad as they did and nobody was going to Nationals games, they wouldn't be making the kind of money they're making on revenue from Masson that helps them. The Nationals being good has been a real boon to them.
Yeah, and also how long. And one of the things you have to give credit to Steve Bisciotti and the Ravens is when Steve has sensed that, whether it's for one season or he thinks it's going to lop over into a second season, he generally acts because he knows that it's a really short window because something else is going to happen. And look, some of the dollars that are floating out there and available from millennials or other kinds of fans are going to go to the Caps next year because just by mere fact of what they've done over the last 2 months, right? So you have to be very careful in sports marketing executive, especially working for a team, that doesn't go on because, look, that money for next season, whether it's corporate money or individual season ticket money, is going to move because it's going to move to success, whether it's the Nationals, whether it's the Capitals. The Washington Redskins have figured that out and made 2 very significant hires on the business side of the organization because they finally have come to the conclusion that they have lost out. They don't have a digital ticketing platform. They don't have some of the things that younger, newer fans and other organizations have. And when people compare, next year's another budget cycle for corporations. Next year's another home budget cycle for people. They're going to find ways to spend that money in those places in and around D.C., for example, if they have the opportunity. You're going to see many, many more people riding that MARC train, riding that Metro, riding that shuttle back and forth between Baltimore and Washington for Capitals than you ever have. You saw it in the parade. You saw it firsthand, and that's just going to continue, that pipeline. That's going to come at the expense of some of the local franchise, and particularly the Orioles here.
He is Marty Conway. He is the professor of sports business at Georgetown University and also an advisor to all things World Cup to the folks of Qatar and watching the World Cup. We'll get to that in a minute. But in the meantime, I'm trying to fix the Orioles. Yeah, Marty, this is sort of your work as well and what you do in writing in LinkedIn and trying to take the higher level in all of this. I know you have great interest in what I'm doing over the next 5 or 6 weeks, and part of it is snark for them being in last place and how they're going to fix this, but this is the turning point for them, and I guess it is unfortunate that the old man sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but the the transparency, the integrity with which the operation, works at this point, that has to be a prime mover in changing this, because they can't win on the field right now. I don't know that they could win a PR battle by hiring Tony La Russa or hiring some name that would lend credibility to this. Quite frankly, they probably need to hire somebody we haven't heard of, honestly, as opposed to hiring Rick Dempsey as the manager next year or whatever crazy thing that they would do or they're about to do with Brady Anderson. But when you start to pick apart the pieces of this organization specifically, as it relates to when the Ravens have won or the Capitals who've just won or any other organization that wins, this is where the seed gets planted, where you make these key decisions to say, how are we going to sell tickets next year? How are we going to make our baseball team better? How are we going to make our operation and our business better? And at this point, if John Angelos and Lou Angelos are taking stock of that, what are they doing about it? Because there has been functionally nothing through a 20-50 start that they've done. They haven't fired a hitting coach. They haven't moved a janitor around. They haven't changed the light on the scoreboard. I mean, they've done nothing through all of this malaise. That unto itself is a really poor message to send to the people.
Yeah, you haven't done anything that demonstrates that the losing is necessary, if you will, almost, right, to turn into winning. That's the methodology of the Houston Astros. That was the methodology of the Kansas City Royals, and you can go back and see all those, the Washington Nationals, when they lost 100 games 2 or 3 times in a row, which brought them Bryce Harper, which brought them Steven Strasburg, etc. So within that body of losing, you have to be able to demonstrate to people through messaging, through actions, that says, this is where we're headed. This is a necessary, at this point, this season, as the lost season we might call it, is maybe necessary in order to bring the prospects, the draft picks, etc., that would put you in a position to be going from a 100-game loser to a 100-game winner in a short period of time. This is not the first time the Orioles have gone through. This is the depth of really losing, but they've gone through periods, and prior to 2012, where they had that sort of malaise. And you need this to be an emotional trigger for people, right? Because people don't invest their time or necessarily their money. Fans invest their emotions. And once you don't have that, and I clearly think you don't have that right now, if you look at the crowds, where people just aren't really willing to just invest their emotions in the team, because they, as I said earlier a few minutes ago, they can invest their emotions in the Capitals or the Nationals. The All-Star game is coming in July, all those types of things. So when you don't have that sort of philosophy, and anywhere at the ownership and leadership level, then you just get what you get. And that's in closing, I think that's where they are. That's why anything that they have done, these are little, small, tiny moves to move this person up, that player down. Nothing really resonates with people to say, okay, this is the stake in the ground. This is the pivot into a new direction, and we'd like you to stick with us, or that sort of mentality. It just doesn't exist. I'm not sure why. I have my feelings about it, but we'll see what happens, both with the health of the owner over the next 6 to 12 months, and then determining what happens. What happens in that vacuum.
Marty, what's Major League Baseball's responsibility in all this? I mean, Selig always hated that the thing was atrophied. They know in New York how incompetent these people are. They're watching it from afar. Buck and Dan and the dangling part of Duquette and the lawsuit, with Masson, over $400 million in disputed money. We saw the Nationals last week say, well, the old man's not running the place anymore. Ted is handing the keys to the son, and Mark Lerner's going to run the company now. We haven't seen any of that in Baltimore. I don't know that fundamentally this family knows how to be honest or how to be transparent or how to be fan-friendly or how to talk to people or how to deal with the media or how to deal with business, buyers and suits and marketing people. They've not been proven to be competent, good at, or interested in most of this, yet here we are where it was always sort of, well, the old man will gum it up, and all the word is the old man's not gumming up anything. It doesn't have a vote anymore from what I hear. But then there comes this, are these kids capable of running this? And where does Major League Baseball fall in on this to say how much is too much? Where are the depths before someone will say or do something to aid these people? Because they're about to go on this thing where they're going to try to hire somebody to run the place. And you know as well as I do, Marty, you're one of those competent people, and they can come and offer you $1 million to be the COO or the CEO or the whatever, the headmaster. And Marty comes back from the Lucchino and the Edward Bennett Williams. He'll fix everything. But how would they sell you on that? How do they get a competent Marty Conway, a competent Buck Showalter, a competent Ned Coletti to come and take a job here where they're not transparent people and there's no track record that they know what they're doing, or that these kids are going to be able to support you, or their mother will be a good business partner for you to pick up whatever you're doing in the Cape Cod League and come here and run this baseball franchise with Brady Anderson in stirrups over in the corner playing chess with guys in the clubhouse.
Yeah, well, when Bud Selig was commissioner, he really favored, and he said this publicly many times, it's why the Lerner family ended up with the Nationals, and that is he really preferred the family model in terms of ownership. He thought there was a lot of Bud valued stability over, discontent and discord. So he thought the family model. And
boardrooms running a baseball team's not a good idea either, right?
Yeah. So that's part one. Now, again, I don't know what Rob Manfred's mantra, so to speak, not to torture the metaphor there, but as to what it is. Having said that, what they value is, look, teams come in here and it's a revenue sharing model, and other owners only tolerate mediocrity in certain franchises for a certain period of time. They've tolerated Oakland. They were no longer going to tolerate Miami. They really wanted that to change. And so there's a couple of things that really trigger leadership of Major League Baseball and the other owners themselves into, pursuing change in a franchise. Legally, there's nothing they can do. I mean, Peter has been one of the most litigious owners in his time with Major League Baseball, and they still have a very big issue going on. I think
he's the most litigious person they've ever met. I mean, they've never met an Al Davis.
Finley.
Well, okay, Finley was 45 years ago. Fair enough.
Yeah, right. I think other than Charlie Finley, he's probably it. He's the one person that I think fits in that. But to your point, on the other side, what is required? It's an understanding that you are going to put the necessary resources to be competitive. So, for example, I think it's very well known that the Orioles, as an organization, ownership, do not believe in the Latin American scouting model, which in baseball, when you look at where the top players are coming from, for the most part, they're coming from Venezuela, Dominican Republic. Look at the youngest and best players, and you'll see that a huge majority of them, not being present with an academy and all of that, just puts you in a position today in baseball where you can be lucky. You can also look at Rule 5 picks. You can look at some players from Japan or Taiwan, but it's not going to get you the consistency of doing that. So that's number one. And number two, that you really believe in the corporate relationships that go along with it, and it's not just there to put promotions out on the weekends. That you really believe that the corporate community, including small businesses for season tickets, really are a partner of you in this effort to rebuild. Those are just a couple of things that if you don't see those, then you really wouldn't be interested in, again, yes, it would be a general manager's job for somebody, and there's only 30 of those. But if you don't see those kinds of things present in the mindset of the ownership, then you would just stay away from it, because you'd never be able to make meaningful change if those kind of philosophies aren't there. You can't have, for example, philosophy that, corporations are a bad thing, that they're constantly taking from people, and you can't be on the other side of that with lawsuits and different things. That's what's happened in Baltimore over time. And yes, there are still some business partners of theirs, but there's a whole lot of other people that ran from that and said, I really just don't want to be a part of that.
He is Marty Conway. He is professor of sports business at Georgetown. He is watching the World Cup. He is watching the Capitals' aftermath, and he is helping me along with many, many others with thoughts on my Dear Orioles series. My letters begin this week. They will be fired out 3, 4, 5 a week for the next 4, 5, 6 weeks as this thing sort of folds or unfolds. Last thing on the Orioles, Marty, and I will seek you back after the 4th of July and as I go down to Washington, D.C. to watch an All-Star game that was supposed to be held here in my city and be an economic, a mover here. But and also see a lot of Stanley Cup hats down there while I'm at it. But just the last thing on the Orioles, these are the most important 5-6 weeks in the organization for all the reasons we've indicated. Where do you expect to wake up August 1st with the franchise, and where do you expect to wake up February 1st with the franchise in regard to Machado, Jones, Showalter, Duquette? They're now interviewing Ned Colletti's, in front of Duquette, who has known forever that he isn't here, doesn't want to be here. You've got the old man situation and John and Lou and what they're going to do, and Brady Anderson and your stars, your Machados and your Joneses, the guys that are on the side of your wall, they're on your ticket stubs, they're on your website, they're on your billboards, they're gone, and Scopes batting 200. This is really going to be a nuked earth policy, and they're going to wear this. We lost 100 games for 6 months of the offseason. I don't think they're going to be selling a lot of skyboxes and club seats. The only thing they're going to sell is we brought new human beings in, and these are the new human beings. They're not going to sell me that they're better than Machado or Buck or Adam Jones, but they're going to have to sell that to somebody over the next 6 months.
Absolutely. So your first question was really what to expect. Well, if the old phrase that passed is prologue, then I don't expect by August that there's a tremendous. I think the Machado trade happens mainly because the trade deadline forces it to happen. I think if he had his way, whoever the ownership suite is today would say, well, we just didn't get what we wanted, and we want to stay competitive. We want to win as many games, blah, 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 blah. But I think the trade deadline is going to force finally the Machado move. He's not. I wouldn't think he's going to be moved in the division. I think that's also something that they would not want to see him playing third base or shortstop in Boston or Toronto or any of those sorts of places.
Wherever you're sending him for 8 weeks. I mean, get the best players you can get. If the Yankees have the best players, put him in pinstripes and let him run off to the Bronx and hold your nose for 8 weeks, right? I mean, the Yankees are then going to have to be the ones that pony up the $318 million to keep him, right?
Yeah. So I think that a Zach Britton moves and a Manny Machado moves. I'm not sure Adam Jones moves. I frankly, I might be surprised unless there's something that really, really fits. I think Arizona's a place that potentially he could go, but I'm not into the baseball side. But so I think the moves on the baseball side will be whatever the minimum is and whatever the trade deadline forces. I don't see other wholesale moves of players where so and so is pitching well and can really help somebody potentially win a pennant or a World Series. And then I think on the other side, I do think you'll see some change in the front office. And again, I think that change comes from people who are not currently in general manager roles or assistant general manager roles. I don't think the Orioles have the sort of reputation in the industry where, number one, somebody's going to leave a job in Seattle or Kansas City or someplace else and come here. I think it might be a rewrite of the Duquette scenario, which is somebody that has been out of baseball, maybe was in it for a long period of time. Ned Colletti certainly fits that script, having been a general manager in places. And so I see that sort of, which are, in my view, look, they're kind of half measures. That's not the kind of rehabilitation project that you're going to find. Look, I think the Nationals did it right. They had somebody who really understood scouting and development, and Mike Rizzo. They were willing to lose for a couple of years, knowing what the talent level was in the draft. And if you knew that Harper was coming and Strasburg was coming on the draft, you were willing to go ahead and lose that 100 games. I just don't see that in Baltimore because I don't think there's a sense that it's okay to lose if we puts us in a position in the draft. I think they foolishly would want to win a few more games this season in hopes of, offering something to the fans. But if that dropped their draft position from first to fourth, I think that would be a tragic mistake.
Marty Conway is here. Let's move on to the Capitals in the aftermath there, and then we'll get to World Cup, which I know you absolutely want to get to here. And I mean, if the Orioles didn't stink so bad, we would have done 30 minutes of World Cup because we're both as into it as all that. Just the aftermath of the Caps and their opportunities. It really has been an amazing run. I'm talking to the Al Kokens and the Craig Laughlin's and everybody this week locally about all of it in totality and what it represents. But from your business mind and from your citizen mind and from your sports background in marketing and business, this is the exact opposite of the Orioles, right? Like, this is where you want to sign on and say, let's drink in the good times. We've got a championship here, and we've got a real chance to go out and be representative next year. This isn't the end of an era, and Ray Lewis is running off, and Ed Reed are running off. I mean, all these guys are coming back, and they're coming back as sort of conquering heroes right now. This is a fascinating time to see what will happen for the sport, for kids getting on skates, for people falling in love with the brand in the way they have in Boston and Chicago and in New York 50 years ago, and it still matters in those communities. Washington never had that sort of inherent thing. It now has something to say. Maybe it becomes a hockey town the way Detroit did.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I would say Detroit. I would say a couple of other cities like that. Even what happened, the transformation what happened in Nashville, right? When Nashville went from, having struggled through the whole process and expansion, all that, and being competitive and being in the playoffs, to finally getting into the Stanley Cup, and what's happened to the fan base there and energized. Look, the thing about hockey is you don't need a really huge fan base. You really need a tight, organized, I think I've said this before, the capacity crowd for a hockey game is amongst the smallest in all sports. It's 18,000 something and 19,000, that sort of thing, for the most part. So you don't need this huge, wide support, which they have now. What you really need is a really tight, wound-up, engaged fan base to do that. And they have captured this at the right time. Look, quietly, what I think happened was you saw an integration of younger players in the last 2 or 3 months of the season, certainly since December. I think they were prepared that if that trended the way, if you looked at what November, December, maybe even early January, the way that it was trending, I think there was a likelihood of breaking up this team. This was the window, and it was finally closing. Certain veterans might have either moved on or taken lower level positions in terms of first line, second line. And then you saw some of these young players come along, and in the last 2 months or so, that blend is what really works. So now, yes, they transition to a new season. They've got some free agents to consider, but ultimately the core of the team comes back. And what happens for an NHL team is it really just extends. I've said this before. It's all about season tickets. It's all about creating that idea that it's hard to get a seat. And it had been that way with the Caps for a number of years. But last year was the first year within many where they were actually advertising for individual seat buyers. You would watch games and see some empty seats on the lower level. People weren't necessarily showing up. Well, that's all going to go away now. And the Capitals are going to be in a position to take more than their share of revenue. I told you that the Redskins made a couple of moves on the business side because I think they recognized that the Capitals were now poised to take, I think they saw some of that revenue leave and go to Capitals and to Monumental Sports. And so the race is on, and it puts the Capitals in a position, along with the Nationals, of being really strong. They're also, by the way, opening a new soccer stadium in downtown D.C. in mid-July, and D.C. United is going to try to, put their oar in the water in that regard. So it's going to get really competitive, but it puts the Capitals in a position to be first among others in terms of new revenue, corporate money, international money, all things like that.
But it's a whole different thing when you call the bank or the hospital or the business or the national brand or the brand in New York or the cool web brand out in McLean, Virginia, and say, Stanley Cup champs on the phone. You want to make a meeting with us? From a sales perspective, as a guy in a suit, that changes everything, Marty.
Yeah, and also they begin to call you because now they, like I said, the new budget cycle, sometimes they're July, August, October, whatever it is. They start to look at that franchise and say, well, we have a marketing plan, an advertising plan, and it needs some activation around the holidays or.
Hey, what year's our Redskin deal up, and when's that Nationals deal up?
Right.
And right, I mean, there's a lot of that goes on. Let's move our money over to hockey. Our people want to go to hockey games, right?
Yeah, and so as a result, it starts to look like how do we activate our marketing plan around the Capitals? or players on the caps or different things like that. So that's what happens in that transition is people start to think for themselves, and the phone rings both ways, both making outbound, but now certainly a lot more inbound ideas, and you get agencies and other small business executives saying, hey, I'd like to figure out a way how to put my brand in this mix. And it's a really interesting time for franchises to go through that. And now their challenge is, can they extend that and make this a blueprint, like you said, for a place like Boston or Detroit or another American city, or even like a Nashville, that can really now generate that sort of excitement and sustain it, which I think they can. They've got really good, smart people down there. They've got good organization, great leadership on all fronts. So I think the sky's the limit, no question, for what happens for the Capitals next year and potentially the year after.
All of our WNST programming brought to you by our friends at Royal Farms. Real fresh, real fast with the Cone to Blend coffee. Make sure you're checking out the ROFO Rewards program. You download that app, you'll get your Western fries and your fried chicken free. Also brought to you by our friends at Cole Roofing, and it's certainly summertime and the heat early this week. Tearing up the roof out there. You got a corporate or commercial roof space. You need my pal Bill Cole, Cole Roofing, and Pfister Energy. Marty Conway is our guest. You can find him at Marty Conway on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and anywhere good sports business ideas are sold. Also, the professor of sports business down at Georgetown. All right, we've been at this 30 minutes. We haven't talked any soccer because of the Dear Orioles series, because the Caps won the Stanley Cup last week. We've had a lot on the plate here. Baltimore getting World Cup, the United States and North America, and building the wall, ripping the wall down, pissing off Trudeau. Canada's getting games. But in 2026, this thing's going to be here again. It's probably the biggest story in this country that no one sort of takes stock of, and we're not playing in the tournament right now, and I'm getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to watch Croatia and whatever, and I'm into it and you're into it. But 8 years from now, this thing's coming here, and it's just a huge, huge story that has sort of been a little bit, like a little wave that crashed in, because we got a crazy president, we got lava overflowing in Hawaii, and we got kids shooting up schools. But the World Cup story in every other country would be just this incredible story that we're getting this tournament coming here in 8 years.
Yeah, you're right, 8 years from now. But what happens in the U.S., and it's not surprising because it doesn't happen in Russia or it doesn't happen in Qatar, because it's an everyday story once you're awarded something like that, is it's a 1 or 2 or maybe 3 day story, and then it recedes into the NBA free agency, the Major League Baseball All-Star Game, the U.S. Open, different things like that.
The Orioles stinking, right, exactly.
Yeah, it recedes into the background and becomes, frankly, just a business story, which is hard for a lot of people to comprehend and sometimes gets a little complex. But it is a significant impact around the world. Look, it is the world's #1 largest sporting event, whether you judge that by interest or whether you judge it by revenues, any of the metrics that you want to go by. It is the #1 business and sports story world over every 4 years. And so as a result, yes, it's going to come here. It's also significant. This is the first time, 2026 will be the first time, where we'll have the expanded World Cup to 48 teams. The last time that it was in the United States in 1994, there were 24 teams, and moved to 32, and now it's going to 48. So there'll be 80 total matches throughout the World Cup. And as part of this united bid, the U.S. will have 60 of the 80 matches. Canada will have 10. Mexico will have 10. And those matches will only be up until the quarterfinals. Everything from the quarterfinals on will be centered in the United States. And the other key point was that the united bid, prior to going to FIFA, announced their cities that will be part of that process. And they got it down to 23 cities, of which 17 of those are U.S. cities and 6 are either Mexico or Canada. And yes, Baltimore made that cut into the 17, the group of 17. And so it remains to be seen whether it will be here in Baltimore in 8 years or whether it will be 40 miles down the road, 100 miles up the road, or what that process will be.
I mean, there is a chance Baltimore could get a game or two. There's also, according to, and I talked to Terry Hasseltine last week, as well as Pete Caringi. because they could put teams here and base them here and have them train here as well, with Washington being down the road, Philadelphia being up the road, New York, that if 3 or 4 teams decided to base here, or 2 teams decided to base in Baltimore, train in Columbia, train in Baltimore, whatever, that would be unto itself a huge, huge win for our area. I would say our area is going to get games. You're going to be able to get in your car and drive. Probably the World Cup final will probably be in New York. Probably. Maybe L.A. I don't know. But Chicago being out is interesting to me. Marty, the fact that Baltimore's in, okay, great. We've always tried to get in. We played some games here. We don't have an MLS team here. We do have a very sufficient stadium here and an interesting airport and an interesting corridor story. But it will be a major, major shock if I'm looking at my window 8 summers from now and seeing Croatian Sweden playing a third game here or something, right? Like, you don't expect games to be here, but there is a chance, right?
Yeah, so the breakdown would be this. So, yes, out of the 17 cities that they've broken it down, essentially there's 10 American. So let me back up. First of all, the United bid has put forth that the finals would be in New York. So that's been determined. Now, FIFA will ultimately select, but the recommendation from the bid committee was the finals would be in New York, the semifinals would be in Atlanta and Dallas. So those would be those 2 cities. So what does that open up? So number one, you've got 3 cities that essentially the United bid is saying, out of those 10 American cities that remain, here's what we have, right? Here's what we have. Now we're looking at an additional 7 or 8 potential cities that can make that list out of the 17 total. And so if you look at it, Washington, quite frankly, is likely to get the opening match. If you look at the World Cup history over the last 2 decades, for the most part, whether it's Moscow or other places like that, the capital city, if possible, has hosted the opening match. It's a lot of pageantry, a lot of celebration, etc. So I think Washington is the likely contender for the opening. And then you're going to want to put games in Los Angeles and in Seattle and in potentially Miami, places where the ethnicity and the culture will drive ticket sales. Houston, yeah. So FIFA, of the United Committee bid cities, FIFA is now going to come in and select who those final cities are. The bid committee isn't going to make that final recommendation for Baltimore, Philadelphia, Washington. It's going to be FIFA. And as you alluded to earlier, there's 4 cities in North America that have hosted matches in the past that are not going to be doing it this time. Vancouver, which hosted the finals of the Women's World Cup in 2015, and then Chicago, Glendale, and Minneapolis, so Glendale being just outside of Phoenix, where they've hosted the college football championships, and Minneapolis, those 3 all backed away.
Why did they get out, by the way? I mean, why does Chicago and Arizona, that would be in for a Super Bowl, in for any big event, for them to not want to play has opened the door for Cincinnati, Kansas City, Nashville, and Baltimore to at least be involved. So, I mean, one thing that happened in Baltimore's favor is Chicago and Arizona and Minnesota with beautiful stadiums aren't getting it.
Yeah, so they backed out based on a 12-page document, which I have put in my Twitter feed over the weekend if anybody wants to go out and take a look at it. A 12-page document from FIFA that pretty much sets forth what the conditions are if you're selected to host a World Cup match. And that includes things like, so for example, FIFA is a chartered organization in the country of Switzerland. So they expect and demand that they be treated as a Swiss company under taxation policy and all other policies for if they're going to bring, frankly, their business to your community. So what does that mean? That means a tax-exempt policy, not just for FIFA, but for their organizations that surround them, contractors and others. So that's number one. So that idea of taxation, it's going to be a tax-free situation.
We're going to take all of the money, and you're going to get to throw a party, pretty much, right? So,
for example, any revenue that comes from ticket sales belongs to FIFA. So if you were to be in Baltimore for an Orioles game or Ravens game, you know that you buy a ticket, and part of that ticket price includes some sort of amusement tax or some sort of local tax. That's over, right? So that means FIFA, if the tickets are $75 a piece, they're going to collect all 75 of those dollars. And they're going to say to you, yeah, but we bring people into your market, and so those people who buy food and drink or other kinds of things in and around the stadium, that money is going to potentially come.
Yeah, we're bringing Brazil to your city, so right, okay.
And that's number one. Number two of the big areas is a waiver free on anybody coming into the country or to your city. So that means not only players, but they're automatically eligible for visas. So essentially, FIFA treats themselves like a foreign, like
a country,
like a country, right? And so they want diplomatic treatment for anybody connected to the World Cup. What does that mean? That means they can bring in, here's my list of people that are going to travel to your country, and we want them all to be admitted. And if there's any doubt about that, we don't bring the World Cup to your country, right? So
including gangsters.
Yeah, including that. So to answer your question, why did the cities pull out? They saw this kind of risk that they couldn't determine. Well, what is our political risk? What is our economic risk? And because it wasn't answerable by the time the bids were due, they said, no thanks, we're not a part of it. So essentially what's happening is if you're selected and they inform Baltimore that you're selected and they say, here's our list of demands, you're saying that by agreeing to host, you're accepting all these demands. So I don't think that was something that the city of Baltimore or the media really conducted much in the way of thorough examination. And so in my view, I think those cities, which clearly Chicago, Glendale, Minneapolis, some of them that already have Major League Soccer teams, or Vancouver, if they weren't willing to do it, what makes you think that some of these other cities would be really, at the end of the day, it would be a great benefit to do it? So I think that Baltimore does have a chance to, like you said, host a match or potentially two, but I think there's a greater possibility that they are a training site for 2, 3, or 4 teams as an East Coast base, and that the games themselves maybe end up in Boston, New York, or Philadelphia, or certainly Washington.
Well, that would be a wonderful thing if we got 2 measly games but 4 teams trained here. That would be a massive win for Baltimore, right? Literally.
Nestor, I think even if they got 1 game, I think because Washington's going to end up as a charter city, not just opening match. But again, a lot can happen in Washington. Certainly they have FedEx Field, but they might even have a new Redskins stadium by 2026 in the region. So who knows what can happen. But when you stack it up, as you mentioned earlier, you're looking at cities like Nashville and Cincinnati are in it. They are going to have MLS by the time World Cup gets here. They don't necessarily have it now, but they have lower-level minor league soccer. So you've got some markets where you questioned how they got in, but ultimately it's going to be about FIFA is going to look at the support for soccer in the marketplace. And yes, we have some decent college programs, but the lack of professional soccer on a top level, I think ultimately will hurt and impact, as well as the presence of Washington, as it always does. So I think even if they got 1 match as part of a Baltimore-Washington sort of corridor, I think that would be a great thing. But I do think they have a good opportunity for some of the training grounds at Maryland or UMBC or some of the other places for teams that need to base on the East Coast and then fly to their various assigned matches.
By the way, Marty, you teach me stuff all the time. Marty Conway is our guest, and I had forgotten that they had expanded the format. I mean, 60 games in America. You know, I don't think it's outrageous that Baltimore would get 2, because how many is New York and L.A. going to get? I mean, are they going to get 6, 8? I mean, that's a lot. I think there will be space to involve more cities in this instead of less, right?
That's the theory, and that is that when you look at why the U.S. was such an overwhelming favorite to win this set of games, it was. If you look at, there's not many countries around the world. In fact, I might say outside of, a country like China that can do it in the snap of a finger, that can put the kind of facilities together in a bid that would allow for 60 matches to be held. And so I think going forward, you're going to see countries, this is going to be a challenge. And I think that's why FIFA is looking at these kind of joint bids in the future, where more than one country in Europe, more than one country in Asia will host the World Cup, because it's going to be impossible. Can you imagine if the World Cup at 48 teams would have been in Qatar with 80 games in Qatar? Not possible. It would have flooded and diluted the product so much that you would have had many, many games with empty seats throughout, because who necessarily wants to see Tunisia or Croatia or Serbia, some of the smaller countries like that? So this is an experiment for FIFA, and it's a great opportunity for the U.S. in terms of the 80, the total matches that total at 80, but 60 in your country. And I think that's going to drive who hosts future World Cups, is how well the U.S. does with this kind of huge operation that's become. I mean, it's getting to the point where it's almost as big as, say, the NCAA tournament, which brings in that many teams. And you look at all the games packed over 3 or 4 days and what that does to a broadcast schedule. So it's going to be a challenge, but it's going to be a clear opportunity. I just think those are some of the challenges and why some other cities have said thanks but no thanks to this great opportunity. You have to really take a look at that.
I think we did 2 segments today. I apologize for holding you so long, but good for us that in the middle of June, let's see, we're talking about an Oriole remake, the middle of the World Cup, and the World Cup coming to America. Oh, and a Stanley Cup parade. I mean, pinch me, Marty. We got good stuff going on around here. We haven't even gotten any football or golf or any of the other stuff. Always a pleasure. Go back to doing what you do, and hopefully I'll keep you entertained with the Dear Orioles series.
Okay, I'll look forward to it. Thanks.
Marty Conway, he's out on LinkedIn. He's on Twitter. I held him way too long for him, but not for me, because I love having Marty on. He is a sports business professor at Georgetown and a longtime Baltimore Orioles and Major League Baseball executive. The Dear Orioles series coming your way this week. You can find me out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app, becoming crystal clear from anywhere. It is all brought to you by buyatoyota.com. The morning newspaper ships digitally to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. That's brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where we're all getting in shape now that it's nice outside. Move inside. The Lunk Alarm, they're always judgment-free. Get some inspiration at Planet of Triumphs. Also, the Maryland Jockey Club entries for Laurel in our morning newspaper every morning in your email inbox, as well as on the front of WNST.net. Any breaking news when the Orioles deal Manny Machado, deal Adam Jones, you'll get it first on the WNST text service. That is all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis Colatzos will be here on Thursday from 3 until 5, driving you home. It is the SSV on WNST. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.